The renewed Russian invasion of Ukraine was supposed to last a few days. Now it's 4 years on, longer than the war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. What does it show us on the military, social and diplomatic levels so far? And let's remember, it started in 2014. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The evolution of modern warfare over the past century tells a story of speed, of how armies learned that standing still meant certain defeat, or in the best case scenario, a never-ending stalemate. During World War I, the dominant image of combat was the trench, muddy, rat-infested ditches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Industrial firepower, machine guns, heavy artillery and barbed wire made open maneuvering nearly suicidal. Battles along the Western Front, like the Battle of Verdun, became grinding wars of attrition. Commanders measured success in yards gained at staggering human cost. Technology had advanced, but tactics lagged behind. Armies dug in because survival demanded it. The interwar years forced military thinkers to confront a hard truth. A standstill was not a victory. Among those who sought solutions were German strategists who refined a doctrine that would become known as Blitzkrieg. Rather than dispersing forces evenly along a static line, Blitzkrieg tactics concentrated tanks, mechanized infantry and close air support at decisive points. Speed and coordination replaced endurance. Radios allowed real-time communication. Aircraft disrupted enemy logistics and morale. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and later swept through France in 1940, the world saw the dramatic reversal of trench-bound paralysis. Wars could now be decided in weeks rather than years. The shift from trenches to lightning war marked the triumph of mobility. Swiftness was the name of the game going forward. Warfare became less about holding ground and more about disrupting systems, supply lines, command structures, and public will. As military equipment evolved, so did ways of dealing with the enemy at breakneck pace. However, present times and the largest armed conflict on the European continent since World War II would show the world that the lightning approach, if not executed perfectly, is a surefire way to lock yourself in a war where front lines are as still as stone.
I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Reuben F. Johnson. He's the director of the Asia Research Center at the Casimir Pulaski Foundation here in Warsaw. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
We've seen on our clip the two faces of war. One is an attritional, static, one in the trenches. The second one is a more mobile, fluid form of warfare. But as we were talking before we came on air, can you give me a first-hand account of your experiences during these initial phases of this renewed invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it was evident from the very beginning that as the Russians came in, they were not prepared for this. They did not have a plan. There were stories about some of the Russian units who climbed into helicopters who were sent in the very first waves, and it wasn't until they were on board and they were in the air, there was, oh yeah, guess where you're going. I mean, they had no idea. And so you contrast that with something like in the very, very recent times, the famous raid on Maduro in Venezuela, where there was a model built of his home and everything around, and the troops rehearsed. When you have an important special operation, that's what you do. Yeah. You set up a model village, and so none of this happened. All very, very unprofessional attitude. Troops stealing, troops murdering civilians. When I was personally captured by the Russians and held underground for almost 2 weeks in the area where they machine gunned the automobile with me in it and everybody else in there with me as well. Fortunately, nobody died. But all around this area, you could see it just looked like the aftermath of a rock concert or something. There's no NCO Corps apparently that's doing anything. There's no small unit discipline, and it's only gone downhill from there.
So this indiscipline and lackadaisical attitude to war was apparent from the very first hours.
From the very first, and then of course we had that spectacle of those columns that were 35 kilometers long or something coming out of Belarus towards Kyiv, and the vehicles broke down on the road, and then the vehicles were attacked by local militia, and they never got to Kyiv. It was just underserviced equipment that was not prepared. No one was prepared, and you can't go to warfare without training. You can't go to warfare without. If you try to do something in warfare that you haven't trained it until you can do it in your sleep, you're going to get your head handed to you, and that's what happened.
Was this as far as you can ascertain, was this a capricious attitude by President Putin to just send these troops in, or was it just his staff not telling him the right home truths, as it were?
Well, his staff, I don't know how many years it's been since his staff has told him the truth. It hasn't been recently. But it was his attitude, along with that of a lot of other people, that, we're just going to walk in and there'll be a victory parade in Kyiv in 4 days. And a lot of these soldiers that I talked to and saw, and other people have confirmed this as well. They've heard the same thing. These soldiers, they brought their dress uniforms, their parade uniforms with them. They thought they were going to have a victory parade in 4 or 5 days, and they'd be going home. They were all told that, you're going home in a few days. And here we are 4 years later, and hundreds of thousands dead.
And the initial phase was a mobile phase. We saw on our maps on the television these tentacles coming in from the north, east, and the south. Where would you say was the first turning point, the major turning point that repulsed the Russians?
Well, probably two things. Number one was the failure to take Kyiv. That was pretty tragic, or pretty fatal to the Russian attempt. And then, of course, the Russians never being able to take Kharkiv, which is right on the border. I mean, this is, how much easier can it get? And I noticed on the clip that everyone's talking about Blitzkrieg. Everyone always talks about Blitzkrieg, okay? But there's a lot of misconceptions about that. Blitzkrieg works very well when it's a surprise attack, which this one kind of was, but kind of wasn't. It works very well when your enemy is, very short distances. Your enemy has very good roads. Your enemy has the same rail lines, and you can just sweep in, and you don't have to go very far. And before your enemy knows that you've occupied their lands, and that's why the whole German invasion of the Soviet Union eventually runs out of steam, because the distances are huge, and when you have supply lines that long, you've got big problems.
How would you gauge the you were taken captive for a couple of weeks initially, but how would you gauge the morale of the Ukrainians around you once you got out of there and you managed to observe
the Ukrainian
stuff around you?
The Ukrainian morale has just been, you probably couldn't ask for better in many cases. Even including troops in the barracks in Kyiv in the early days of the war, where they knew there was a big Russian column headed their way. The morale was because they knew they were fighting for their country, they're fighting for their way of life, and the actions by the Russians over the years, several attempts by the Russians to destabilize the Ukrainian government, invading Crimea in 2014, invading the Donbass. There was plenty of hatred for the Russians to go around, and that's a powerful motivator.
And we seem to have seen several phases to this war so far. A mobile phase initially, then repelling the Russian invaders, Ukrainian counteroffensives, and it seems to have stagnated, if that's the right word, on the eastern frontier. Is that an accurate picture of how you see the war over the last 4 years?
It's stagnated because neither side can achieve some kind of a operational breakthrough. The Russians have failed to come up with the type of innovation that, to the level that the Ukrainians have. I mean, both sides are using drones to a great extent. Both sides are using all types of new age warfare, but the Ukrainians have been much better, much more creative about it, much more adaptive. That's partly because that's their nature. That's partly because the Russian system doesn't encourage that type of creativity. It's too much that's top-down driven in terms of the command structure.
We'll discuss the technological race after looking at our next clip.
Surrender out of his sight.
The end of World War II marked the beginning of a technological arms race that reshaped the battle landscape for generations. Armies that had relied on massed infantry, heavy artillery, and armored breakthroughs began to pursue speed, precision, and information dominance. The Cold War accelerated advances in jet aircraft, guided missiles, night vision, and satellite reconnaissance. By the time of the 1991 Gulf War, US-led forces demonstrated a new model of warfare. Stealth aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and real-time surveillance combined to overwhelm Iraqi forces in a matter of weeks. The lesson seemed clear: future wars would be fast, networked, and decisive. In the decades that followed, professional militaries invested heavily in drones, digital communications, and advanced battlefield sensors. Conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan further embedded the use of unmanned aerial vehicles for surveillance and targeted strikes. Lightweight body armor, GPS-guided artillery, and encrypted radios became standard equipment. The expectation among many strategists was that the technology would shorten wars and reduce the need for static defenses. Yet the war between Ukraine and Russia has frustrated that assumption. What began in 2022 as a campaign widely expected to hinge on rapid armored thrusts and air superiority has, in many sectors, devolved into trench systems stretching across hundreds of miles. The surprising driver of this regression is not a lack of modern equipment, but its abundance, particularly small, inexpensive drones. First-person view drones used as guided munitions and persistent aerial surveillance have made open maneuvering extraordinarily dangerous. Any concentration of troops or vehicles can be detected and targeted within minutes. As a result, both sides have dug extensive trench networks reminiscent of World War I, using camouflage, electronic warfare, and dispersed formations to survive. Paradoxically, the same technologies that promised fluid, high-speed warfare have reinforced the value of concealment, fortification, and attrition, demonstrating that innovation does not always eliminate the past, but sometimes revives it in a new form.
All the experts seem to say, or the experts on the television, in the expert think tanks, they seem to say this is the new phase of 21st century war. This domination of drones over a belt of land that can see everything. Anything that moves is immediately pounced on. Is that an accurate thing to say, or is this one of these? Do you expect a breakthrough in some sort of technology like the machine gun against the barbed wire, that sort of thing, or the tank against the barbed wire and the machine gun in the First World War? But first of all, let's get to how did these two sides come to have this belt of drone technology in the East? Who was the initiator? And from what you say, it's the Ukrainians that seem to be doing the innovation in this technology.
Yeah, it really was the Ukrainians, because if we can remember back in 4 years, feels like a long time.
Ancient history, then.
But in the beginning, okay, here's a Russian tank. How do I kill that Russian tank? Well, I've either have to have a tank of my own, which is going to cost some millions of dollars, or I need to have some very, very sophisticated anti-tank guided missile system. I need to have an in-law or Javelin, or Carl Gustav or something. And these things are very expensive. But what's happened now? Well, they're killing tanks with drones that are $1,500. So it's the most cost-effective type of warfare you could ask for. And the great thing about a drone, a missile doesn't have any brains. Once you fire it, it's got a seeker, but it's gonna travel in the direction that you've aimed it at. But with a drone, I've got an operator. There's an operator who can literally go around corners, and he can see tanks on the other side of a hill behind a building, things that a missile cannot. And this was the type of innovation that the Ukrainians determined very, very early would negate the Russians' numerical advantages on the battlefield.
And you suggest that this was a bottom-up movement by local companies, local enterprises, set against the top-down attitude of the Russians. That seems to be one of the key factors in this.
Yes, a lot of unit level innovation. This just didn't start in 2022. I go back to 2014 when they were fighting in the Donbass, and the Ukrainians were asking for what we call counter battery radar from the United States, which is a system that will tell you where the artillery piece is as it fired at you. And the Obama administration didn't want to give those to Ukraine because, perish the thought, the Ukrainians might actually hit a Russian artillery battery and kill some Russians. So what did these these young, very intelligent servicemen do? They got out their iPads and they wrote applications on the iPad to essentially calculate reverse trajectory of an artillery system. So they've been very innovative now for more than a decade.
We talked about the similarities or not of strategic bombing in the Second World War, that Russia sending over hundreds, if not thousands, of missiles that seem to be indiscriminate. Can you tell us about how Ukraine is tackling this and using charting the flight paths of these missiles?
Yeah, this is a contract recently was signed between the Ukrainians and Palantir, the American data analysis company, which is it's huge military applications for this sort of thing. And since we now have 4 years of recorded flight tracks of missiles and drones, because every time someone fires a Patriot missile or one of the other Western-made air defense systems, you're collecting data. So you've got a huge amount of data now, all of these different flight tracks. And Palantir is proposing, or has proposed and has signed a contract, they can take all this data into a big data facility and then use AI as a mechanism to develop, predictive methods for these flight tracks. And we've seen this before. It's coming from, and this allows you to kill the drone or the missile from a further distance out. Plus, you add to that the development of some low-cost air defense interceptors, which are coming online now. And this makes the whole proposition of shooting these things down further away much more plausible.
One of the great successes that the Ukrainians have is in the maritime sphere. They have no surface navy to speak of, but they've achieved dominance in the western half of the Black Sea. They've managed to push away the Black Sea Fleet.
Yeah, we've defeated the Russian Black Sea Fleet by a country that has no navy, and what's left of the Black Sea Fleet has run away to Novorossiysk. But this is kind of the same sort of genius we've seen. The sea drones being used against Russian ships, and then the long-range drones that are being used against Russia's oil industry. It's the same type of the ability to strike further and further out all the time.
Where does this leave us on the diplomatic front?
Well,
Russia seems to be grinding on. It hasn't modified its war aims to get the total dominance over Donbass and later on over the whole of Ukraine. Where do we go?
They've never changed a maximalist set of demands since day one. Those have never changed, and they're never going to get those demands.
Is that naivety on the Western part that seems to talk about peace talks and peace plans?
I think it's worse than naivete. I think it's absolute reckless folly is the way I would describe it. I mean, you're sitting down to negotiate with people, and when this latest round of negotiations in Abu Dhabi, when they saw who the chief Russian negotiator was, Medinsky, they should have realized, okay, this is going to be a waste of time. This is
very acerbic negotiator.
The Russians will never scale back those demands until they reach a point where they believe things are collapsing around them, and if they don't back off, they'll lose everything. That's at the point when they might change their position.
Is that a naive article of faith that the West has, that somewhere along the line, or Russian collapse is just around the corner?
I think it's well, I don't think the idea that Russian collapse is coming is naive, because we see indications of it all the time. There was just an article in Fortune magazine this week by an interview with a woman who had worked at the central bank, talking about how the economy is just being hollowed out from the inside. But there's huge naivete on the Western side, people saying, listening to this Kirill Dmitriev, who's one of Putin's negotiators, saying, oh, well, I have $12 trillion worth of deals to do. Really? Your economy is a $2 trillion economy, so how are you going to do that? They're going to try the same old tricks. They're going to borrow the money from the West to buy things and then find ways not to pay it back. I mean, this is ludicrous. And I'm sorry, somebody pick up a phone and call Bill Browder. He'll tell you you'll never make any money in Russia.
Yeah.
That's all you need to know.
What about war fatigue after 4 years or after 10 years, since 2014, amongst the publics in Europe? Is there a difference in the eastern half as opposed to the western half? Is it just from the west? Does it look like the war in Poland in 1939, a country that's long way away, and we're just kind of tired of it?
Well, first of all, no one has the right to be fatigued except the Ukrainians themselves. You know, anybody else who's saying they're fatigued, they need to grow up. The second problem has been absolutely abysmal messaging in some of the Western capitals, particularly in the U.S. And I always point this out to people that in the early days of the Biden administration, we were sending hardware to Ukraine, and there would be numbers that would be, oh, there's another package going of this much money. And Americans would look at that number and they'd say, oh, well, this is like Obama when he put, hundreds of millions of euros on pallets and sent it to Iran. And you had to stop. And I must have said this a million times to people. This money is not going to Ukraine. The money is going to American defense contractors to make hardware to replace the stuff that we took off the shelf. And it's giving a more work and a greater livelihood to American defense workers, and it's revitalizing our industry at a time when we really need it. And oh, by the way, I don't care how much money it is, there's not one American who's had to die. Now that's the best deal we're ever going to get. And all of this, these numbers with all the zeros, all of this hundreds of millions of dollars, fine. It's 5% of an annual U.S. defense budget, 5%. And people are complaining. It doesn't get any better than this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, cheap at the price. As we draw our discussion to a close, Poland is building up its armoured forces, its artillery forces. As one of the frontline eastern flank nations, is it, given the fact of the technological advance between Ukraine and Russia, is it investing in the right kind of equipment? You were saying before about the tanks being not cheap drones knocking out expensive tanks. Are we fighting, or are we making weapons or buying weapons to fight the last war?
I don't think we're buying weapons to fight the last war, but when you're buying weapons, you have to understand, if I buy the latest tank and the latest helicopter and the latest fighter and the latest this, they don't suddenly magically come together and create it. You have to come up with a battle plan, and you have to train, and you have to exercise, and you have to say, we're going to use certain platforms to do certain things. So does Poland really need 96 Apache helicopters? Would 60 do? I don't know. But it kind of really depends on how you're laying out your air-land battle and how you conceive of going up against a Russian force. God forbid they should cross the border.
And will they cross the border with loads of tanks, World War II style, I suppose?
Well, they may only have World War II style tanks left at that point.
Yes, of course. Reuben Johnson, thank you very, very much for coming onto the programme. We'll have to draw it to a close then.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Okay, great. Right, that's all we have time for today. Join us next time. You know the time. Tuesdays, 9:35, 21:35 CET. So, see you then.